Congratulations, you scrolled to this newly released 2008 horror movie, The Eye, right when your phone battery has a 7 in it. This $1 million budget movie grosses $60 million worldwide after its release. Tens of thousands of people rate it a high score of 6.3. Rumors say a mysterious cold wind often blows through the set when the lead actress films the hospital and abandoned factory scenes. Many crew members also feel a very heavy atmosphere. The story begins. The female-led, Sydney Wells, is a versatile and pretty girl, but a childhood accident plunges her into endless darkness. Sydney Wells finally agrees to get a cornea transplant after repeated persuasion from Helen Wells. The surgery goes very smoothly a few days later. When Sydney Wells wakes up, she vaguely feels a dying old man lying in the next bed. Just then, a girl named Alicia Millstone walks in. It turns out Alicia Millstone is also a patient at this hospital. Unfortunately, she has a malignant tumor in her brain. Alicia Millstone turns around and leaves the room after a brief greeting. Soon, it is time to remove the stitches for Sydney Wells. When the doctor slowly removes her eye patch, Sydney Wells vaguely sees a shadow man quickly flash before her eyes. Late at night, Sydney Wells is awakened by a strange noise. She turns her head and finds a shadow man standing by the next bed. Right after, the shadow man leads the old woman slowly out of the room. Sydney Wells subconsciously calls out the old woman's name, but she seems completely unable to hear it and keeps walking forward without looking back. Feeling something is wrong, Sydney Wells immediately chases after her. But strangely, the old woman vanishes into thin air. Just as Sydney Wells is about to return to the room, a cold voice suddenly comes from behind her. She sees the old woman standing not far away, staring at her motionlessly. Just as Sydney Wells wants to step forward to see what is going on, the old woman disappears without a trace in an instant. Just when Sydney Wells looks confused and before she can even recover her senses, the old woman suddenly appears right in front of her again. Watching the old woman walk towards her step by step, Sydney Wells hesitantly reaches out her hand. Right at the moment her fingertips are about to touch her, the old woman bizarrely disappears once again. Early the next morning, Sydney Wells wakes up and immediately asks the doctor where the old woman in the next bed went.
Where's Mrs. Hillman?
Oh, I'm sorry. She passed away last night.
Sydney Wells freezes instantly after hearing this because she clearly saw the old woman walk out of the room with her own eyes last night. A few days later, Sydney Wells can finally be discharged from the hospital. At Alicia Millstone's suggestion, the two of them take a photo together. Just a heads up, this is an important foreshadowing. After returning home, Sydney Wells plays the violin alone. Just then, a strange sizzling sound suddenly echoes in her ears. She follows the sound and discovers it is actually coming from the oven. Curious, Sydney Wells reaches out and opens the oven door. Before she can react, her vision is consumed by a ball of fire. The next second, Sydney Wells suddenly wakes up. It turns out it was just a nightmare. After confirming she is safe and sound, Sydney Wells casually presses the clock. Make sure you remember this exact time. Not long after, while flipping through her music sheet, Sydney Wells turns around and sees a shadow man flash past the door. Out of curiosity, Sydney Wells opens the door and walks out. But the hallway is empty. She has no choice but to continue walking deeper into the hallway. After taking a few steps, Sydney Wells suddenly stops. She turns her head and sees little Tommy Chung in a raincoat squatting on the ground. Although startled, Sydney Wells still politely greets Tommy Chung. While the two are talking, a voice from afar catches Sydney Wells' attention. When Sydney Wells turns her head back around, little Tommy Chung has already disappeared. At night, when the clock strikes 1:06 a.m., Sydney Wells has an extremely bizarre nightmare. The dream is full of jingling bells and a little girl in visible distress. The number 106 also repeatedly appears in the dream. Not long after, Sydney Wells wakes up from the nightmare with a start. Before she can catch her breath, she realizes her home is constantly twisting and deforming. It looks like it is switching back and forth between two different houses. Sydney Wells thinks she is hallucinating. Just as she is about to stand up, she notices an old chair appearing out of thin air by the bed. A grim rope from the vision also hangs above the chair. Sydney Wells does not pay much attention to it at the time. She turns her head to look at the opposite wall again. Watching the constantly changing scene before her, Sydney Wells hesitantly reaches out her hand. Just when her fingertips are about to touch the wall, the chair next to her suddenly shakes on its own. Immediately after, everything in the room returns to normal. A terrified Sydney Wells quickly checks the time and finds it is exactly 1:06 a.m. The next day, Sydney Wells finds Dr. Paul Faulkner, who performed her surgery, and tells him about all the recent strange events. Dr. Paul Faulkner gives her a comprehensive checkup. The results show Sydney Wells's eyes are completely normal. Dr. Paul Faulkner thinks she might be experiencing post-operative visual disturbances, but Sydney Wells firmly believes everything she sees is real. No matter how Sydney Wells explains it, Dr. Paul Faulkner still refuses to believe her. Sydney Wells returns home and sits on the sofa alone watching television. Just then, a puff of white smoke suddenly drifts in from outside the door. Feeling something is wrong, Sydney Wells immediately gets up to check. She first glances outside through the peephole. She sees a figure standing in the thick fog. In the blink of an eye, the figure bizarrely vanishes into thin air. While Sydney Wells is completely confused, she turns her head back around to find the entire living room already enveloped in white smoke. Countless people's cries for help also echo in her ears. The white smoke gets thicker and thicker. Sydney Wells is soon choked breathless. To survive, she desperately runs toward the front door. But after taking just a few steps, she is surprisingly transported to a completely unfamiliar room. The room is crowded with people, all yelling that it is on fire. Just then, a man engulfed in flames rushes towards Sydney Wells. Right at the moment the man grabs Sydney Wells, the previous nightmare scenes flash through her mind again. Immediately after, Sydney Wells wakes up with a start. She thinks this is just another nightmare. But when she turns her head to look at her arm, a clear handprint of a man surprisingly appears on it. What is even more bizarre is that this handprint quickly disappears. Overwhelmed by terror, Sydney Wells quickly goes downstairs to call Helen Wells. Unfortunately, Helen Wells does not answer the phone. Just as Sydney Wells is about to cross the street, a woman unexpectedly passes right through her body. They both look at each other in shock. Suddenly, a roadside accident not far away catches Sydney Wells's attention. Sydney Wells hurries over to take a look and discovers the victim in the roadside accident is actually the woman who just passed through her. Sydney Wells looks back and sees that the woman is already gone. When she turns back again, the woman is standing next to her own motionless form. A shadow man is also standing next to her, as if to take her away. Immediately after, the shadow man disappears with the woman, right in front of Sydney Wells. Terrified, Sydney Wells runs away and rushes into a nearby Chinese restaurant. She first makes a phone call to Dr. Paul Faulkner, but unfortunately, he does not answer either. So Sydney Wells leaves a message for Dr. Paul Faulkner telling him her location, hoping he can come find her as soon as possible because she is currently terrified to the extreme. Just as Sydney Wells hangs up the phone, the menu next to her suddenly flips a page on its own. Sydney Wells stands up and looks at the chef in the kitchen. She sees the gas stove flames next to the chef burning stronger and stronger. Immediately after, the entire restaurant experiences a catastrophic blast. When Sydney Wells regains her senses, she finds herself standing in a pile of ruins. She is just about to leave this place. But Dr. Paul Faulkner arrives right at this moment. Sydney Wells tells him everything that just happened. Dr. Paul Faulkner is greatly shocked after hearing this. He says this restaurant was destroyed in an earlier fire a few weeks ago. Sydney Wells simply cannot believe her ears. She was clearly just eating inside the restaurant. Seeing Sydney Wells rambling incoherently, Dr. Paul Faulkner thinks she is under severe psychological distress. Sydney Wells cannot be bothered to explain anymore and heads straight home without looking back. Just as Sydney Wells is about to enter the elevator, she suddenly notices a strange man standing inside. Sydney Wells stays cautious. She turns her head to look at the security monitor nearby. Sure enough, there is nothing on the screen. Just then, a couple walks into the elevator. Sydney Wells looks at the monitor again. There is still no sign of that man on the screen. So Sydney Wells quickly calls for another elevator. After confirming there is no one inside, Sydney Wells finally walks in. Everything is normal at first, but not long after, Sydney Wells suddenly sees a figure in the elevator's reflection. She turns her head in disbelief. The man from earlier is actually standing right behind her. Watching the man approach her step by step, Sydney Wells frantically presses the elevator open button. Right when the man is about to touch Sydney Wells, the elevator doors finally open. Terrified, Sydney Wells rushes out without looking back. Before she can even run to her front door, she meets little Tommy Chung in the raincoat from earlier in the hallway again. At this moment, Sydney Wells only wants to hurry home, so she completely ignores him.
No! No!
Just when Sydney Wells is about to go home again, Tommy Chung appears again and keeps following behind her. Fortunately, Sydney Wells opens her front door in time and shuts Tommy Chung outside. After returning home, Sydney Wells completely breaks down. To never see those bizarre things again, she shuts out every source of light. Finally, Sydney Wells locks herself inside the house and cuts off contact with everyone. A few days later, Dr. Paul Faulkner comes to Sydney Wells's house. Looking at Sydney Wells's injured arm, Dr. Paul Faulkner takes her back to the hospital. At night, just when Sydney Wells is sleeping soundly, a voice suddenly calls her name. Sydney Wells gets up to take a look and finds out it is Alicia Millstone, who she met earlier. Before the two can exchange a few words, Alicia Millstone suddenly says she has to go. After speaking, Alicia Millstone walks out of the room without looking back. Feeling something is wrong, Sydney Wells immediately chases after her. As soon as she comes out, she sees the familiar shadow man standing next to Alicia Millstone. Thinking of what happened to that old woman last time, Sydney Wells hurriedly shouts for Alicia Millstone not to go with him. But no matter how she shouts, Alicia Millstone acts like she cannot hear anything and keeps walking forward. Finally, Alicia Millstone disappears at the end of the hospital hallway. Sydney Wells can only squat helplessly in the corner and cry bitterly. Sydney Wells learns from Helen Wells that Alicia Millstone passed away. The next day, afraid that Sydney Wells is too sad, Helen Wells hands her the photo they took earlier. Looking confusedly at the photo, Sydney Wells actually asks Helen Wells who the person in the picture is. Helen Wells tells her it is just herself. But Sydney Wells says it is not her at all. After saying that, Sydney Wells walks to the mirror and sees herself completely transformed into another person, and only she can see this appearance. Sydney Wells realizes all of this might be related to the cornea donor. So she asks Dr. Paul Faulkner who the cornea donor really is. Dr. Paul Faulkner says this information is strictly confidential, and his medical license will be revoked if it is leaked. Sydney Wells has no choice but to turn around and leave. Just when Sydney Wells and Helen Wells are about to go home, a woman follows them into the elevator. As soon as the woman walks out of the elevator, Sydney Wells sees little Tommy Chung once again. The director does not explain exactly what happened to Tommy Chung here. He personally guessed Tommy Chung might not have achieved grades that satisfied his parents. After being scolded by his parents, he cannot think straight, and his fate remains unclear. Sydney Wells returns home and walks to the mirror again. She directly asks the person in the mirror what she really wants. As soon as she finishes speaking, Sydney Wells's hands suddenly lose control. Immediately after, the previous nightmare scenes flash through her mind again. To figure out the whole truth, Sydney Wells decides to find out the donor's identity on her own. Just then, Dr. Paul Faulkner comes looking for her. To Sydney Wells's surprise, Dr. Paul Faulkner actually tells her the donor's information. Afterwards, the two of them find the donor's house based on the address in the file. An old woman named Rosa Martinez opens the door, and at first, she does not welcome them until Sydney Wells mentions her daughter, who is the cornea donor. The first time the old woman sees Sydney Wells, she surprisingly recognizes her daughter's eyes at a glance. It turns out the old woman's daughter is named Ana Cristina Martinez. Ana Cristina Martinez can see things others cannot see, since she is little, and also possesses the ability to sense approaching fate. When she is a child, Ana Cristina Martinez often sits crying at other people's front doors. And not long after, someone in that family passes away. The nearby villagers all think Ana Cristina Martinez is a jinx and ostracize her like a witch. Just as they are talking, Sydney Wells suddenly sees that shadow man appear next to the old woman. Before they can react, the old woman suddenly suffers an attack and faints. The fallen old woman says some strange words, saying her daughter relives her final moments each night and begging Sydney Wells to save her. After speaking, Dr. Paul Faulkner hurriedly takes the old woman to the hospital. Sydney Wells walks into Ana Cristina Martinez's room alone. Soon, Ana Cristina Martinez's past life experiences flood into Sydney Wells's mind. It turns out Ana Cristina Martinez used to work in the same factory as her mother. One day, Ana Cristina Martinez has a premonition that an industrial disaster is imminent. Ana Cristina Martinez originally wants to persuade everyone to leave quickly, but they treat her kind warning as crazy talk. What is even more infuriating is that after the fire breaks out, everyone actually pushes all the blame onto Ana Cristina Martinez. In the end, Ana Cristina Martinez cannot bear it all and meets a tragic fate. By the time Sydney Wells wakes up, it is already dark. Dr. Paul Faulkner also rushes back at this time, but unfortunately, the old woman ultimately could not be revived. With no more clues, the two can only leave in disappointment. After driving for an unknown amount of time, the two are forced to stop due to a traffic jam ahead. Only after getting out of the car to ask do they find out that the police are apprehending a fleeing suspect, so they blocked this road. Just then, Sydney Wells suddenly sees a familiar little girl, and immediately after that, she remembers that recurring nightmare. Seeing Sydney Wells acting strangely, Dr. Paul Faulkner quickly grabs her. In the moment Sydney Wells turns around, hundreds of shadow men successively board a bus. Seeing this, Sydney Wells immediately rushes toward the bus. When Sydney Wells sees the tanker truck next to it, she instantly understands Ana Cristina Martinez's intention. It turns out Ana Cristina Martinez has been pestering her all along just to make Sydney Wells prevent this tragedy from happening. By the time Sydney Wells reacts, the bus is already filled with shadow men. Seeing this situation, Sydney Wells quickly tells everyone to get off the bus. But the people on the bus remain indifferent, and they dismiss her warning as irrational. Left with no choice, Sydney Wells can only lie that there is an emergency threat on the bus. Hearing this, everyone instantly panics, and they scramble off the bus one after another. Meanwhile, the little girl's mother wants to figure out the situation and steps off the bus. But before taking a few steps, she is knocked unconscious by the panicked crowd. Just then, the fleeing suspect's car rushes over and collides dead-on with the tanker. The tanker instantly bursts into raging flames. While escaping, Sydney Wells discovers the little girl is still trapped in the bus. At the critical moment, Dr. Paul Faulkner shatters the bus window in time. Just as the two rescue the little girl, the tanker experiences a catastrophic blast. To protect the little girl, Sydney Wells is hit by the flying debris, and the blast takes away her sight again. At the end of the story, Sydney Wells loses her sight once again. But perhaps, this is the life she truly wants. See you next time.